Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. This episode, we're speaking to Gary Jansen about his book, Life Everlasting, and his other work. Welcome, Gary, to the podcast.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Well, the first thing we would like to ask you is, would you give our readers and listeners an overview of what your book is? Just generally, it's a book of devotionals from the Catholic perspective. We're interested in knowing how this type of book worked for someone who might not be from that tradition.
Sure. So the book's Life Everlasting, Catholic Devotions and Mysteries for the Everyday Seeker. And so I am Catholic. I come from the Catholic tradition. And, one of the great things I do love about the church and Catholicism is its rich spiritual history. One of my favorite TV shows when I was growing up was Scooby-Doo. And Scooby-Doo was great because every week there was a new mystery to investigate. And a few years ago, when I really started investigating my faith, the faith that I grew up with, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, I realized that Catholic faith is a lot like Scooby-Doo in that there is always a mystery to investigate. You can go through all these different strata of the religion, of the dogma, of the spirituality, of the mystics, of the saints. And what you find are these incredible occurrences, these incredible thoughts, these incredible spiritualities that a lot of times don't get talked about in mainstream media, and they don't even get talked about in church. You really, in many ways, if you want to be a spiritual seeker as a Catholic, really go into that kind of pursue that mystical and spiritual experience, you really kind of have to do your own homework, and you have to do some serious work there. So what I've tried to do, and just the work that I do, is to try and take some of these rich mysteries and make them palatable for an everyday kind of person, whether you're Catholic or just a spiritual seeker. It's really important for me to take out a lot of the Catholic jargon, which I think prevents people from understanding or prevents people from just kind of being open to certain things. And then, and just showing and really kind of showing, hey, these are things that I've done. These are spiritual practices that I've gone through, that I've used in my life, and that they've been transformative. And I like to share them with other people.
Now, we've been talking to a lot of people about spiritual practices as ways to be transformed or to transform yourself. For example, we talked to a author who wrote a book called From Anxiety to Love, and she talked about how that helped her get through anxiety was by creating her own spiritual practice. So are you putting out the idea that if Catholics or people who are interested just in this type of liturgical year and saint stories and that sort of thing, to use it as a way to grow themselves spiritually?
Yeah, absolutely. The book talks about a number of different things. It talks about the saints. It talks about the Virgin Mary. It talks about Jesus. Talks about the Holy Spirit. All of these are pathways to God, right? To a deeper understanding, to a deeper level of consciousness and awareness. When we look at religions around the world, I would never say that all religions are the same, because they're not. They're very, very different. They have very, very different dogma. They have very, very different practices. Many of the religions believe many, many different things, but they all draw from the same well. And things change as it comes up through the ground, let's say, using that metaphor. But they're all drawing from this same place. And depending on geography, depending on social status, depending on education, depending on just geographic location, things are changing. Things are different. I mean, we're different. People in the West are different from people in the East, and their culture and the way that they approach life. And so when we're able to kind of draw or go deep into the well, which is what spiritual practice is all about. It's not about a surface experience with yourself or with God. It's about a deeper experience. It's not just, hey, how you doing? When you go out for coffee or something like that. It's really about, hey, what are you feeling, right? What are you experiencing? And having a deeper conversation with yourself, but also with God. And I think spiritual practice, once you're able to kind of dig deep and find out, it can help you understand where the root of your anxiety is, or also be kind of medicine to help you deal with that anxiety. And there's kind of a twofold thing going on the more and more we kind of work on our spiritual practice.
One thing that I think is kind of interesting about what you're saying, it sounds like you're talking about having kind of a direct relationship with God and a direct experience of that spiritual exploration. Now, I'm not Catholic. I wasn't raised in the Catholic Church, but everything that I've heard is that traditionally the church was supposed to be your connection to that. Individuals were somewhat discouraged from seeking a personal connection to God, and that was, at least perhaps maybe in the modern Catholic Church, this is somewhat evolved, so dogma has changed. But is that what you're talking about here, is that individuals within the Catholic tradition can have a direct relationship?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that the history of the saints really is a history of that direct relationship with God. The history of Jesus is about that. That deep connection with God in so many different ways. Absolutely, like in the Catholic faith. I think the one thing that's tough about the Catholic faith is that it's got really bad publicists, and it really kind of it needs a really good like publicity team in order to kind of bring out, what's so great about the faith. Now, I say that partly tongue in cheek because there are a lot of great writers and there are a lot of great speakers, a lot of great priests and nuns, right, who do a great job of this. But unfortunately, like in mainstream media, if you're not kind of in it, you're getting kind of like a superficial idea of what the church is. And the church has always been kind of this joint. Church is obviously the external, right, or the exoteric, right, experience. But there's always been like an esoteric pathway for Catholics or Christians from the very, very beginning of Christianity. Now, we just know in society that not everyone's geared for that. Not everyone's interested in that sort of thing. But there definitely is a history of saints, of martyrs, of writers, of thinkers, right, who have broached and touched on and explored the esoteric, right, which is this deep kind of personal inner experience where we're striving for union with God. And that's really what my book is about. Life Everlasting is really about how do you develop that mystical pathway? How do you develop that mystical experience in your own life, being someone who works every day or commutes or runs a podcast or, works in a Starbucks or in a Fortune 500 company. There are possibilities and there are pathways in order to have this kind of deeper experience of God.
So you don't think that the formal church leadership, they don't have a problem with that then? That do you think they recognize that there are individuals who do want to have that personal exploration? I've just felt a certain degree of pushback in that personally when I explore my relationship with God or with Jesus or with spirituality. And I've just in my personal conversations with people, some of whom have been Catholic or other traditions, I've just had people just correct me and say, no, you're not supposed to do that. Is that simply because they are the type of people who aren't looking for that? They just don't believe that you could do that? I mean, could you? I'm curious what the formal Catholic organization, like the church itself, how it views that. You've got your opinion on the tradition of the saints and how various mystics have had those relationships, but does the church really have a position itself on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had my catechism here actually, so I could kind of like quote from it. But no, absolutely. Again, this is kind of this whole idea of there's an exoteric experience and an esoteric, and not necessarily esoteric in the way that we may use it now today in the form of esoteric works or occult works. But again, this kind of inner experience. And just the fact that, and one of the things is just the fact that the church acknowledges and puts so much attention on saints is evidence of this, I don't want to say allowance, but about this reality that all of us can have this deeper personal relationship with God. Now, one of the things that really helped me years ago is I took this Myers-Briggs test, right, which is this kind of personality test to find out whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert, whether or not you're a thinker or a sensor, whether or not you're a feeler or a thinker. And it is kind of like, it was essentially originated from Carl Jung, right? So Carl Jung came up with these personality types. But over the years, Myers-Briggs had developed, who were students of like Jungian psychology, were able to develop this Myers-Briggs test. And then once you start like realizing that everyone around you kind of has a different profile. So like I'm introverted, like an intuitive feeler perceiver, right? An INFP. And someone might be an extrovert, right? But also very judicious about stuff. They may like rules. Like I'm not a big rule guy. I kind of push back against rules, but there are other people that in life where it's, if you don't cross the T's and dot every I, if you don't follow everything exactly how it has to be, well, that rocks them, right? That throws them totally off. So there are definitely within the church, a very, very conservative faction. And I'm not, that would feel very uncomfortable maybe with certain levels of like meditation. But I think even if you push those people in general, they're really into their faith, they would say, absolutely. There's times where I pray by myself. There's times when I recite the breviary, right? Or pray 5 times a day, or pray 3 times a day. And I'm having a very deep, relationship with God. The rosary, which I would say most Catholics, conservative or progressive, may be very interested in, is one of those ways.
It's interesting that the rosary and the mala and the japa beads all correspond with the 54 beads on the rosary and 108 in the East, and how it's almost like there must have been a tradition going far, far back that started and, led to all of those.
Yeah, that's kind of an idea that me and Janae have been talking to some of our guests about and kind of exploring, is that in the old world, there's this kind of modern conception that before the modern world, there was Europe and there was Asia, and, until Marco Polo went to China, nobody talked to anybody across, the Eurasian continent continent, and there was no exchange of ideas or anything. But what we've been kind of looking at is like, you've got the Middle East, the Holy Land, and it's really kind of dead set in the middle there. You almost definitely had people and trade and ideas going back and forth across there. So I really don't think it's that far of a stretch to think that going back to, the time of Christ, that you would have had people, mystics from the East coming through with, Hindu mysticism and Buddhist ideas, and you would have had, Western Greco-Roman Platonic philosophy and all that all just kind of colliding in the Middle East there. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why so much of this religious tradition sprang up in that geographic location, because it's just kind of right there in the convergence of three continents.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you like study like plate tectonics, when you have one earthen plate like folds under another, you get mountains, right? And so you can look at this intersection of these three continents as this like mountain region of spiritual exploration and spiritual faith. I mean, Aldous Huxley, it was Huxley, right, who wrote the Perennial Philosophy. So, and that's all. Then that's what you guys are talking about, which is there is this, and I think this is what I'm talking about as well. There is this deep well that different traditions, draw from. It changes as it comes up, through the strata. And I do think the more that you like study history and the idea of the Silk Road and all pathways, that by the time of Jesus, there were wise. I mean, it says it in the Bible. There were wise men from the East, right, that came to visit the baby Jesus. So they didn't just like show up when he was born. Obviously, they were in the, not necessarily the three kings, but obviously there were people like the three kings that were in the area at the time. There was an exchange of ideas, and there was an exchange of trade. It hasn't really been. I mean, it's been explored somewhat historically. I know it's been explored historically. In a general sense, we don't really have a ton of like authors that are like focusing on that. Karen Armstrong does a really good job in her books. But it would be great to see more historians unpack that information for us, because I think you guys are right on the money. You have this intermingling of ideas, which again, I don't think negates the Jesus story at all, or the foundation of Christianity. But I think it just kind of comes back to this, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and everything that comes out of us, right? There's a spark of God, and no matter where we're from.
Yeah, that's and it went the other direction too. I was in my own research poking around a couple years ago, and when Alexander conquered Central Asia, he brought Greek sculptural traditions, sculptural techniques to the East. And when you see like a modern statue of Buddha that's very like realistic, that's actually there's actually a, what do they call it, like Greco-Buddhist sculpture, where they were using Greek realistic marble carving techniques to make representations of the Buddha. Like if you look at earlier representations of the Buddha, they had a stylized technique, and later representations they look much more realistic. And that's literally because the Greeks were going to Asia, and the same time you had the wise men coming from the East, you had ideas going from the West going that way. So I think there's definitely evidence to say unequivocally that there was a transfer of ideas,
kind of like a deliberate avoidance of admitting that.
Yeah, that it really is
Western elitism.
Well, there's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of colonialism, and there's a lot of Eurocentric kind of worldview. This is something we've talked about with other guests, where Eastern philosophical ideas or Eastern concepts are kind of mystical and inscrutable, and perhaps quaint and curious, but not really worth considering as real philosophy or as real theology. I think that really comes from a 17th, 18th, 19th century colonial view where Europe was going out and conquering and civilizing all the savages, and this was all their quaint superstition. I think there was a lot of wisdom even in Christian thought and Jewish thought that probably came from and borrowed from these traditions, that now when we went out and conquered, we were thinking of it as superstition. But I think a lot of those ideas, like I listen to Christ's teachings and I see a lot of common threads with those perennial ideas.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think this still exists today. Recently I read an article by a very, very conservative Catholic about the dangers of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness for Catholics. Catholics should not practice mindfulness. And I think this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Spence, about this, you've heard from some people who say, you shouldn't have a personal relationship with God. Really, it should just be a church community. And so you obviously have there are different viewpoints. Again, so much of this is based on where people are growing up, what their value systems are. It's so complex. But this idea of mindfulness being something that's bad for Catholics, is something that I've heard before. it was mindfulness, it was centering prayer. That was a bad thing, right? And centering prayer is essentially, I don't know, again, it's this kind of mindfulness technique where you're trying to kind of quiet the inner mind. You're focusing on your thoughts, right? You're trying to get to a place of peace and kind of, but at the same time, openness. Some very, very conservative Catholics today believe that if you get to that place, especially a place of openness, that it can really detract you, right? And it can enter, evil spirits can enter in and all that stuff. And I'm really like, I'm of a different mind of that. I mean, mindfulness practice, one, was practiced by the saints, right? It's practiced by Jesus when he goes off into the desert. You might not call that mindfulness, right? But but there was this time of solitude and this time of being alone and needing this time to kind of pray. And so, mindfulness today is also a very like easy way for like Newsweek and Time Magazine and New York Times to talk about prayer, right? Because it's mindfulness, right? It's not prayer, but they're both, they're sisters or brothers, whatever you want to call them. I disagree. I mean, I think mindfulness is a great practice for Catholics. And I think incorporating what I write about in this new book too is also the practice of heartfulness, right? Because mindfulness, and I know I'm taking a very kind of simplistic view of what mindfulness is right now, and saying you kind of focus on the thoughts that are going on in your head and all of that. And you try to come to a place where you're accepting and, use meditation to do this and breathing techniques. But you know what? Heartfulness is really kind of this is paying attention to the emotions, right? Paying attention to feelings. It's the mindfulness of the Bible. When Mary finds out that she's going to be the mother of Jesus, right? The angel Gabriel comes to her. So you have this very angelic kind of like direct experience. You're talking about, Spence, you're asking before, a lot of people tell you that in Catholicism, there's no like personal experience, but Catholicism is partly based on tradition. And the tradition is that Mary had a very direct personal experience with God, right? And that's through the power of the Holy Spirit and the angel Gabriel. And when she finds out all of this stuff, right, that she's going to be the mother of God, she doesn't ponder this in the head. In sacred like Catholic iconography, you never see like the sacred brain of Jesus. No, Mary pondered stuff in her heart, right? And that's how like the ancients, that's where they thought the center of intelligence was, right? And so instead we see in the icons the sacred heart of Jesus, the sacred heart of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, right? And so this blending. So anyway, this is just to come back to that there are people, right, who are, I don't want to use the word necessarily prejudice, but I think they have their own belief systems and get fearful of things that if they come from the East or they seem to come from a mysterious place. And I think that's really just because it's a superficial understanding of where things are coming from.
I agree totally. I think what it gets down to is our magazine's slogan is dedicated to elevating consciousness. And I think that's what it comes down to is they're just afraid of the unknown and they've just never been exposed to ideas that are different from what they're used to. And if it's different, it's scary.
Yeah, there's a the pattern that I seem to see over and over again in various traditions is that there's those very rule-oriented people who they view religion as you're a member of a religion, there are a set of rules, there are a set of beliefs, the world is this many years old, this is what happened on this day of creation. There's very prescribed, set in stone, fundamental ideas, and that it is very much less about your own relationship with God and your own, like for me, I feel like I have a direct connection with God and I know whether or not I'm doing the right thing. Like I don't have a set of rules that I refer to that tell me whether or not this or that is the right thing, because in different situations, sometimes the same action could be right or wrong depending on the situation, and those kind of very literal, structured rules don't allow for that. You have this slavish relationship with the rules where sometimes even if it's evil, you do it anyway because that's what the rule says to do. And I think that's pretty destructive and toxic overall, that you should be able to, connect with that and look at the situation and be like, you know what, the rule may say this, but in this situation, take something like stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving child. You shouldn't steal things, and the rule tells you shouldn't steal things, but is it more evil to let a child starve than it is to steal a loaf of bread? Like in that case, you steal the loaf of bread and you give it to it, is the way.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a big reason why media doesn't like mainstream media doesn't cover religion in the way that they used to, say 20, 30 years ago. And because it's very complex. These are complex things that you can't make a chart for on USA Today, or try to sum up, in 1,000 words in New York Times. And I mean, having podcasts like this and communities where you can actually talk about these things is really important. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for people who or rule-based. Now, I didn't used to, but I've come to that kind of realization because, again, so much of it depends on who your teachers are, what your economic situation is. I mean, we're talking about this stuff now, but if you're starving or you don't have a job, right, and you're worried about the chaos around you, you're going to have a very, very different outlook than if you're working or you have money or you have health insurance and all of that stuff. So all of these things really come into play about spirituality or religion. It can get very murky when people try to oppress others, right, and try to say my way is the only way, right? And anyone who says that, that they exist from a level of consciousness. It's probably very, very sleepy, right? Because there is so much complexity. At the end of the day, though, it's like T.S. Eliot talks about this in the Four Quartets. Kind of like you leave home to come back to it, right? You start off from one point and you end up coming back to it, but you come back to it changed. And the point being that that we're one with God, right? We have the God spark in us. People will say, we're kind of drops of water in the great sea of God, but that doesn't make us God, right? It doesn't make you or me God. It means that we have that substance, that essence within us, and that's what I kind of like try to come back to. So it's tough. I mean, I've come to that realization over a long period of time, but I do have compassion now for people who kind of have different ideas and don't get as upset as I used to.
Yeah, you have to get to that point. I think that's just, well, I was going to ask you, in your book, you have devotions and mysteries for the everyday seeker. And would you like to find what the difference is, or people who might be interested in your book?
Yeah, sure. In some ways they're kind of interchangeable. I mean, the devotion is really kind of the spiritual practice itself. So I do try to give, I like to do things, and I also work in publishing, right? And just knowing what the books that seem to sell the best and work the best are the ones that are practical, right? And the ones the articles that are shared online the most tend to be the ones that give you 4 or 5 steps. Here's 4 steps to, here's 4 steps to enlightenment. Yeah. and so they like steps. So the book tries to give you steps, right? Which is kind of the devotion. Here's the actual practice. But then it gives you stuff like mysteries, which is things that need to be investigated, that you need to do investigating on if you're interested in kind of like deepening the spiritual life. And if you're interested in something like angels, if you are interested in angels and like learning more about it, well, the book tries to give you some background on angels, but also kind of to spur you to contemplate the mystery of them, which can be really, really difficult, because what I hear from my atheist friends all the time is like, well, Gary, you talk about that all of us have a guardian angel. What about those people that were slaughtered, right? Or were there guardian angels there? You say guardian angels there to protect you, but what happened in Parkland? Where are their angels? I really do not have a great answer for that. It's a very unsatisfactory answer. And it's one like you have to be in a certain place to actually even be able to talk about. But to say that, angels really are there for your spiritual health, right? They're there because they're spiritual beings. They help you spiritually. Not that angels can't intercede at some point and kind of like stop something bad from happening. But it seems to be that when you explore the mystery of angels, that angels are there for your spiritual well-being, where the police or an army or a doctor is there for your physical well-being. Like you wouldn't expect a cop to give you spiritual advice. And I think over years, the idea of like angels has been kind of, I don't want to say misconstrued, but maybe misunderstood. Maybe we do all have angels that watch over us, except they're there to help us with spiritual nourishment, not necessarily save our lives when we're in danger. But this is something for people to explore.
Of the various types of devotions that you have in your book, what is the one that you think is the most interesting?
A lot of people ask me, like, what can we do? Like, I want to start spiritual practice. I want to start developing my spirituality. But I have no attention span, and it's hard for me to sit down, and I think when we look at the wealth of spiritual literature that's out there, and even like spiritual practice, guess what? It's geared for introverts, right? It's geared for people who can sit down and be quiet. It's not necessarily geared for extroverts, right? Who are talking all the time and need to move around. And so there is this one most holy name. The devotion that I like the best is the most holy name of Jesus devotion, which is simply repeating the name of Jesus over and over and over again throughout the day. One, you have to believe, and I firmly believe, that words have power. Beyond the power of the intellect, they also have a very, very spiritual power behind behind them. That you look at the name of Jesus or you look at the name of God, I mean, the ancient Hebrews knew this as well. So they wouldn't say the name of God, right? They would use Yahweh, or they would use the tetragrammaton as in kind of a stand-in for God, because they knew how powerful God was and is. And that's why one of the commandments is don't take God's name in vain, because when you do, you're kind of unsettling the balance in many, many ways. And so if Jesus is God, then the name of Jesus needs to be held in reverence. But I do believe that if you reverently repeat that name over and over again, it helps you, one, to kind of bring Jesus into your head and your heart. And doing that is really kind of like a great way to just take a first step towards spiritual practice. And you could be someone who's, an expert meditator, right? And you could use this devotion as well. So in some ways, it's like a mantra, right?
It sounds like a mantra meditation type.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but if you look at like Christian literature, that you could go back. I mean, the sacred name of Jesus probably goes back to like the 4th century. So the coming back to this whole idea of this interchangeable, in the Middle East and all of that, where ideas were being exchanged, which came first, which came second, who knows? But you do see that there's definitely this correlation between certain sacred practices in Christianity and Judaism, especially the mystical practices, and those of a Buddhist and Vedic tradition.
I think it's kind of a shame how much of the mystical traditions have been taken out of Western religion in general, that people are returning to that. You see the Taizé style worship coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually talked to a Protestant minister in February, Ian Simpkins, and he started a project called Beauty in the Common, which is very much like bringing kind of a mystical, almost liturgical year type aspect to everyday life. I just really think people are being drawn back into the mystical. I think that was definitely missing, and we need it in our lives.
I tend to get all fire and brimstone on this subject, but I oftentimes think that historically, I think there were perhaps more conservative elements in the church that kind of sought to structure it for personal gain, and that the less you could have a personal relationship with God, the better, because you had to pay for it through the church, basically. And it is very heartening to hear these kind of ideas, and that there's more progressive thought within the church nowadays. But if you go back to the Spanish Inquisition, I think that you would have probably been burned for heresy for proposing some of these ideas. Janae had brought up that she's had people in the past say, well, you must be a member of a religion with a set of rules, because if you don't have a set of rules, then what is to keep you from just going around murdering and raping and pillaging everything around you? And, her response was, well, why would I do that? If the only thing keeping me from doing that is a set of rules, then there's something very wrong with me. And that is sometimes what I wonder is, are there those who are so fanatical about those fundamental rules because they don't feel like they can control themselves, or they don't feel like, they are able to, examine themselves and know what the right thing to do is in a situation. So the only thing keeping them from being Genghis Khan is a set of rules?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, I think you're going to, throughout history, there are always people with different levels of consciousness, right? So rule-based consciousness is one, less rule-based consciousness is another level. I'm not saying one's necessarily better than the other, but it does seem like when you're rigidly attached to rules, that it can lead to very, very bad things. But throwing out rules, right, leads to this kind of like nihilism, and this kind of, it can lead to destructive behavior as well. So I think, again, it comes back to the whole yin and yang or experience where, it's hard and soft, it's light and dark. And I think even the Lord's Prayer talks about this, talks about the yin and yang of experience, that you kind of need both. When it says on earth as it is in heaven, right? The whole idea of correspondences, right? The whole idea that, what you see on earth, right, has a heavenly component, right? Plato talked about this, in the idea of the Platonic forms, that you could have a chair, but in the realm of the forms, which is essentially the spiritual realm, there was chairness, right? This idea of what perfect chair looks like. So there's this kind of perfect idea. There's a good story by G.K. Chesterton, at least it's attributed to him, though I've never been able to find it, where it talks about this school, right? And all the kids are having a great time within this school. They're out playing during lunch and, they're running around, they're throwing the ball, they're laughing, they're having the best time ever. And this guy comes up to the fence that surrounds the school and calls a few kids over and is like, hey, you know what? You're going to have a lot more fun if you tear down this fence. Just tear it down. Just look what, you have all this extra land, you got all these trees that are outside the fence. So just tear down the fence, and then you'll have so much freedom to do whatever you want to do. The kids love this idea. And so they tear down the fence, right? They just destroy the whole thing. And now it's nothing but open land. Well, the next day you come back out and the kids aren't playing anymore. They're scared because now wolves can get in, right? Now cars can cross in, and there's nothing to prevent a car now from coming up and just parking right in the middle of the field. And so what Chesterton is trying to say is that, within a set of rules, you can have great freedom. It takes a certain level of consciousness, right, to do that. But to throw out rules often leads to chaos. And so, again, it comes back to this kind of synergy of kind of rule base and then, this kind of individuality. And so history is this tension, is this tension between these two forces. But I think we see them in all the religious traditions. Judaism talks about it in the beginning where it's like separate the light from the darkness, right? Christianity talks about on heaven and earth, right? The yin and the yang of Taoist philosophy. And so I don't think necessarily throwing away rules is a good thing. Rules can be very, very good. They keep things in check. But obviously being a slave to those rules can often lead to disaster as well.
I think that what you're talking about is, are you familiar with the Kohlberg stages of moral development?
Very, very vaguely. But yes, I do.
Education. Yeah. You learn about how children do things based on they're afraid and they want, approval, or they're very committed to rules. But as you go up the stages, you get to the point where it is, would you steal a loaf of bread to feed a starving child? Or would you, steal the medicine for your dying wife? Things like that. And it gets into those things. And it's just a lot of people just don't get to the higher levels. And that's probably why it's important and why these ideas still stay around, is because we're all in our own developmental process and different people are different stages.
It's something I've often said is I think IQ is, or not an idea without merit, but I think that in some ways it's been kind of a negative overall effect on society, because we've gotten this idea that there are kind of smart people and stupid people, conscious people and there's unconscious people. And, you take an IQ test when you're 12 and they stamp a number on your head, and that is just, you're never going to get past that. If they tell you have an 85 IQ when you're 12 years old, you're just going to go through the rest of your life, I'm a dummy. And I think that's the case. I think that very much people can evolve their consciousness, and that, for me anyway, if there's a meaning of life, it's to continue evolving, and that to continue to wake up to higher and higher levels of consciousness. And I think that, maybe you won't get, maybe if you are kind of trapped in fear on those lower levels of consciousness, and you are still operating that level and you're 70 years old, you may not get there, before your deathbed. But I think that's really Hindus would think that you're going to come back and that you're going to continue to work through those steps until you get it. Right. But I also thought of a metaphor from a military podcast I was listening to the other day. Probably no other human organization in history is more rule-based than the military. Guests on this podcast were talking about some new requirement. I think it was deployability. They're going to try and get rid of anybody who is not deployable to a combat zone. If they have some kind of medical condition or something where they're not going to be deployable for a year, they're going to expel them from the military. The host said, well, there will be waivers. And if there's one thing that's universally true in the military, is that there are endless rules and there is a waiver for every one of them. There's always a situation where, even in an extremely structured rule-based environment like that, there's always a situation where, in this particular case, that rule doesn't apply.
That's something that's coming up as a problem, I think, in our world, because we use so much computers now. Computer is programmed that this is the answer. And if it's not binary. The answer, it throws it back. But maybe if a person looked at whatever it was, they'd be like, oh, I see what happened here, and they could figure it out.
Yeah, and that's something this is I think where I ended up spending so much time thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how these things are starting to affect our society and public policy. Because you do have stuff where you used to have a loan officer who would sit down and consider an application for a low-income housing loan. And now it's being done by a machine learning system, and it's a rule-based system. And you either meet the criteria or you don't.
Right.
You put your information into the machine goes chuk, 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 and then boom, you get a result. There is no higher consciousness consideration of the circumstances because machines are just completely binary, black or white, yes or no. Do you have an income above this line or not? No, you're disqualified. That's it. And that the more our society is controlled and these kind of things are being handled by a computer, the more it becomes clear to me that when rules are applied universally without fail to everyone under every situation, you have the potential for some pretty disastrous outcomes.
Absolutely. There's so much to unpack in like what you said there. One of the thoughts I just wanted to go back to, which will lead, I think, back into this as well, is that when we were talking before about this kind of like personal experience with God, a lot of what you were describing before, it really describes the Pharisees at the time of Jesus, right? And so Pharisees were essentially these scholars, and the scholars were what? They were big thinkers, right? And then you have Jesus coming around and going, you know what? Yeah, I'm not here to overthrow the law. I'm here to fulfill it. I'm here to take it out of the book and make it real, right? And this disturbed him. So this disturbed the Pharisees and that kind of very like cerebral society so much that they had him killed for it, right? And this is Jesus really talking about having a very deeply personal experience with dogma, right? With the law, with rules, that you can have a personal experience with this. You cannot have a personal experience with God. And so that got him killed, right? Essentially for that. And so we live in a society now that is really mind-based. Now people can say, oh yeah, it's not mind-based because people are stupid, and so many people are dumb and look at the dumb TV and all of that stuff. Yes, but not necessarily disagreeing there. I mean, it would maybe not be the most intellectual society sometimes, but I do think that we are a greatly intellectual society. But we become very, very like mind-based. Look when you go on the Facebook, what does it say? It says, what's on your mind? It doesn't ask what's in your heart, right? It's asking what's in your mind, right? And as you're talking and describing how society is changing, where there isn't this kind of like heart interaction anymore, it's really a mind interaction. It's this, I apply for a loan. If I don't meet certain criteria, it doesn't matter if I'm a good person or I'm an honest person or I'm someone who's going to work hard, you're not going to get that loan, right? And so you're kind of wiping out the entire heart. And Rudolf Steiner, talked about the, I'm going to mess it up, but our mean is this kind of like technology demon. And the technology demon is this kind of demon that tries to take just control of your mind, right? And what's Lucifer trying to do, right? Lucifer was this, was this demon, was this devil, was actually started off as his angel. And an angel is nothing but pure intellect, right? And it was this pure intellect that said to God, I will not serve. I'm not going to serve you because I'm not going to serve man, right? And so it's this major intelligence, right, that causes fall, right? Causes a fall. And then Lucifer is like cast down out of heaven, right, into the earth. And Steiner would say that there's this kind of like, oh yeah, so I think it's the division between, no, somehow they're related, Lucifer and Aramin. But Aramin is this kind of like technology that is trying to kind of convert people to technology. And think about how, and this guy was writing over 100 years ago, think about how that prophecy is coming true, how we're attached to phones all the time. And I'm not saying that your phone is bad or your phone is a demon, right? But I'm just saying that we're attached to them. We're attached to social media, right? We don't even like know what we're feeling anymore because we're bombarded with these images, or we're bombarded with words that affect us intellectually and maybe sometimes affect us emotionally, but it seems to really favor like this left side of the brain. And you've kind of like cut out like the heart. And so now you see people, you go online, you post something, and all of a sudden everyone's attacking you, right? Everyone's attacking you. Are they even like thinking, or are they even like feeling like what your life may be? The fact that you're alive and you should be treated with dignity and humanity. They're not feeling, right? They're just thinking. Whatever pops into their head, they spurt out. They're not going deeper into the heart, which is defined as universal consciousness that we all have, right? This thing that unifies us. Not necessarily the one mind, but it's the one heart. And I don't even want to say it's not the one mind, but it's this combination of mind and heart. And so, as you're saying, society now is trying to take the heart out of a lot of different things, and it can lead to disastrous effect.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of technologies where the stated purpose, Facebook and social media in general is supposed to connect you, right? You're supposedly connecting with friends and family. You can have this relationship with them, even if you're not in the same room. But in fact, that when you take the heart out of it, it ends up doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, people just attacking each other.
I have alienated more long-term friends with social media, people I knew for 20 years years that I don't talk to now because at some point we got into an argument on social media over some little trivial thing that maybe I didn't even really care that much about. And now we don't talk at all. And it's really like it kind of drives people apart. I don't know. There's in the Douglas Adams book, Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul, the Dirk Gently series, there's a part where he's talking about the highway system around London. The purpose of this highway system, this technology, was to get people in and out of the city efficiently. Which is it's a good purpose. It's a good intent. But like the practical effect is that it has become this kind of mandala of evil and hatred, that it is just gridlock, and it's people who are just sitting in their cars and they're swearing and they're angry and they're just seething with rage and resentment, and they're taking all that anger and resentment, they're taking it with them to work or back home to their families. In his book, he kind of humorously suggested that like Satan had designed the highway system around London specifically for that purpose, just to bring more evil into the world. And that's kind of almost the dynamic I see playing out with some of these technologies, is that their stated purpose is something like benign and good intent, but their aggregate effect is the exact opposite of what their stated purpose is.
That comes back to us and being heart-centered and being mindful in our own lives, and us making the choice not to put those things out there, and being very conscious of what you choose and choose not to follow and listen to and watch.
If you go back to the origins of the Bible, the temptation happens at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So it's knowledge, right? And social, and so that's where the serpent tempted people with knowledge, right? I'm going to give you knowledge. I'm going to give you intellect, right? I'm going to give you something of the mind. And what they did is they bypassed the heart, right? They didn't listen to what they knew was right. They listened to what was inside their head. So anyway, that's just wanted to respond a little bit to that.
We're coming up to the end of our time. I'd like to ask you if you have any other books coming out or other books you've written in the past you want to share with us. Let everyone know what your website is and if they can contact you via social media.
Absolutely. This might be my final book that kind of explores Catholic rituals and prayer. I've written 4 other books before that, including Station to Station, which is about the Stations of the Cross, and then the 15-minute prayer solution, which is that's really about technique on what you can do within 15 minutes to kind of develop a relationship with God. And so my next book, which comes out next fall, something called Micro Shifts, which are these tiny little changes that you can make in your life that can lead to big results. So while there'll still be a spirituality book, it's not necessarily a Catholic book, though it'll be my Deepak book. I'm going in Deepak's direction of general spirituality. And so my website is www.garyjansen.com. You can go on there and check some stuff out. Send me a note. I get back to just about everybody. Yeah, and that's it.
All right.
It's been great talking to you, and we'll let you know when everything becomes available. And
actually, your other book sounds like it's just up our magazine's alley. So if you ever want to come back and talk to us again.
I'd love to. This is great. You know what? You don't really get a chance to actually have these kind of deep conversations about big things. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. We really enjoyed talking to you. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye now. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER, or call 630-492-0831.